Hello, and welcome back to the Fabric of Industry podcast, episode 9, The History of Industrialization. We're going to hear that word quite a few times today. I'm your host, Adam Grange. I thought this would be a fun episode to do as sort of a segue between our rather dense economics episodes and the secondary sector. I thought it would also be a good idea for us to get a grasp on how industrialization was first shaped and the changes in various forms it has taken along its journey to today. I'd like to look at various places around the world as well and how they've experienced industrialization, and at the end we'll look at where industrialization could be headed next, or if we're in the midst of another industrial revolution right now. This should be a fairly light and fun episode with no recommended pre-listening, but we have a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. And yes, I know I've said many times that this isn't a history podcast, but today we are. Let's start by defining industrialization, though. We can say it is the process of a society transitioning from usually agrarian, agricultural-based societies, or potentially resource-based societies, to one of manufacturing and, industry. It mainly involves the shift from agriculture and handcraft to machine-based production. Technological innovation, usually centered around new forms of production and aiding production, is key. Urbanization is also a typical characteristic, which is massive amounts of people moving from the rural countryside to newly developing and rapidly growing city centers. Growth in investments and infrastructure, called capital accumulation, and a shift to a division of labor specializations and wage-based employment systems are characteristics as well. Countries that can be broadly placed into three categories of industrialization, which somewhat correlate to levels of development. Post-industrial countries, or developed countries, are focused on services because the industries are matured. The United States, Germany, and Japan are good examples. Newly industrialized countries, or developing countries, are characterized by their rapid industrial growth in the last several decades. Good examples are China, of course, in Vietnam, and then India as well. Partially industrialized or underdeveloped countries are still mostly focused on agriculture and subsistence living for the majority of the population. But I believe all countries today have at least an industrial base of some kind. It may not be very strong, it may be very uneven, but some kind of industry does exist. Examples of the partially industrialized countries include Ethiopia, Honduras, and Nepal. Let us also quickly define a couple other major terms. Mechanization is the process of moving from hand or animal work to work done by machines. Machines take power or energy from something and apply it to something that needs work done on it, so that the manual labor can be traded for machine operation. Capital is goods that are produced and then in turn used to produce more goods. Common examples of capital include buildings, equipment, and machinery in the buildings where they're housed, and then even roads, railway systems, things like that. Those may not seem like goods to you, but in economics terms they are, and that's what capital is. Now let's get into a bit of a history lesson. As is perhaps well known, the United Kingdom was the first country to industrialize, which was around 1760, when it was still known as Great Britain. It still may be, but in the United States, we basically just call it England now. This has become known as the First Industrial Revolution. It spread to areas of Western Europe and the United States by around 1840. The First Industrial Revolution was characterized by mechanization through steam and water power, new chemical and iron manufacturing, and most notably the textile industry. Textiles were already industrially, quote-unquote, produced at the time, but through the use of machinery, it became the first true industry. And in a lot of countries that go through an industrialization process, the textile industry is usually the first or a primary industry that gets mechanized, industrialized first as well. Along with massive increases in textile production, investment and income came for all of those things for agriculture. These two key industries led to unprecedented population growth, as well as the average income per capita increasing quite a bit. Canal construction was important for the diversion of water for power and steam generation. Generation itself came about primarily through the innovation of the Watt steam engine. There were steam engines before this, but the Watt steam engine was, well, it somewhat perfected the previous iterations, and it allowed for easy mass production of them. Steam engines themselves are simple, albeit fascinating. They, of course, require a heat source, typically from coal burned in an enclosed space known as a combustion chamber, or perhaps you've heard of a firebox, or maybe even a furnace. The heat is used to boil water inside of the boiler, which is a large pressure chamber containing water. A boiler can either be a water tube boiler, in which water is passed through pipes that are surrounded by the air, heated from the combustion chamber. So it's a big a boiler. Think of it as just a big, usually cylindrical container, and then in the boiler for the water tube boiler, there's a bunch of pipes inside of this big cylinder. And so there's, of course, air trapped in the cylinder, but a bunch of pipes inside of the cylinder as well that the water passes through. And that's what heats the air. The other type are fire tube boilers, where hot air is passed through the pipes, and those pipes are surrounded by water. So the water is enclosed by the boiler, the large cylindrical container, and in the pipes inside, air passes through to heat it up instead of water passing through. I think also I just accidentally confused the two of them. I was thinking too fast there. The water tube boiler has water passing through the pipes, and those pipes are surrounded by air, which is heated from the combustion chamber, and that heats the water, not the water heating the air. That doesn't make any sense. When you're trying to make steam, you want to heat the water. And in the reverse for the fire tube, where air is passed through the pipes, which heats the water still to make steam. Water tube boilers are far more economical, however, and they were the most commonly used type of boiler in steam engines during the Industrial Revolution, or the first one. The motor is the part that outputs the work from an input of high pressure, high temperature steam created from the boiler. Lower pressure and lower temperature steam is an output from the motor, as the motor uses that energy going from high temperature to low temperature to create work, mechanical work. Well, to do mechanical work, as it's just transferring the energy from the steam. It's not actually creating energy. That would not be possible. So where does the steam then go? Out of the motor? Well, it will go into a cold sink, which, if you've ever seen a plume of smoke leaving a locomotive in an old movie or something like that, that is a type of cold sink. Another type of cold sink is a condenser, which is a type of heat exchanger that is usually water-cooled and converts the gaseous steam back into the even lower pressure and lower temperature liquid form of water. Now, this is different water. The condenser is cooled with a different input and flow of water compared to the steam and the water that's used for the steam, of course. Then the water can be recycled back into the boiler, the water that comes out of the heat exchanger from the steam, not the water that's, again, cooling the condenser. That water that comes out of the condenser can be recycled back into the boiler without, wasting it into the environment like a locomotive would. The Watt steam engine was the workhorse of the Industrial Revolution because it was cheap, it was reliable, and it was very modular, meaning it could be hooked up to pretty much everything. And like I said, they're quite simple. Through some pipes and methods of capturing and transferring energy, we could take a fuel that burns and transfer that heat energy through water to do mechanical work that replaces humans and animals. Typically, the factory system was set up around the steam engines because those were the things doing the work and creating the power to do more work. The factory system started to influence even more aspects of life, structuring work days around the factory and dividing labor amongst those workers within, so that the people were known by the professions they performed at the factory, which probably sounds pretty common and pretty close to workplaces today. The factory was just the location of labor and manufacturing equipment, so production could be localized and monitored instead of at-home production counterpart. The at-home production counterpart, which was much more common pre-industrialization, like I said, handcraft and things like that. I keep speaking in past tense, and of course, factories still do exist en masse, and they operate from the same basic principles, just like I said, most other workplaces do. But they do look and act much differently due to modern technologies and institutions. I am just speaking about the Industrial Revolution era factories here. All of these drastic changes to life and income made the United Kingdom an economic and trading world power, it was really the only world power at the time. By the time industrialization had spread to Western Europe and the United States, the United Kingdom had become the lead commercial nation. They controlled the trade network throughout its colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Oceania, as well as hegemony on the Indian subcontinent, which today consists of the countries India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. This led to a drastic increase in the average standard of living of the people in these areas, mostly, which many economists note to be the most important effect of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, most of this was seen at home in the United Kingdom, and colonists and especially slaves that existed in the United Kingdom's colonies, of course, did not see the same kind of increase, but it still was there to a degree. And then this, of course, has led to the Western world developing at a faster rate than much of the rest of the world, because, of course, this was also happening in Western Europe. The Second Industrial Revolution is also known as the Technological Revolution. After the important inventions of the First Industrial Revolution built a foundation, they began to slow down around the 1860s. The Second Industrial Revolution is thought to have started around 1870, where a massive and rapid increase in scientific discoveries, mass production, and industrialization was brought about primarily due to the telegraph, electrification, and the production line. The telegraph was revolutionary in transmitting messages, signals, and information from one place to another far more rapidly than the post service could send letters. Electrification is described as the process of powering a system by electricity, so think about building power grids, basically. The production line was revolutionary in efficient production because it sees sequential operations building multiple parts to be able to combine them into the final product. This combination of communication, electricity, and efficiency saw the Second Industrial Revolution explode beyond the first. One massive technological leap seen here was the advent of interchangeable parts. You might be wondering how something so plain sounding could be so revolutionary, but the invention and subsequent implementation of interchangeable parts everywhere led to much quicker assembly of new devices and machines, as well as far simpler means of repair and maintenance. This essentially increased production exponentially alongside the production line. Other important innovations, like the Bessemer process for mass-producing steel in the United States and open hearth furnaces, were also key in increasing production across industrializing countries. The Bessemer process is particularly fascinating, as it was the first real inexpensive method of steel production. You can think of the machine as sort of an urn-shaped vessel, suspended above the ground on two legs. The first step is to introduce molten pig iron into the vessel. Pig iron is just crude iron, basically just iron ore melted down. Pig iron is rife with impurities, of course, mainly silicon from silicate minerals, manganese, which tends to form near iron, and unbonded carbon. Oxidation is the key first step, in which air is blown through the vessel to introduce oxygen to the impurities, where they are then separated from the iron as a gas or a solid slag. Slag is just kind of the extra stuff that you don't want. The leftover iron then has carbon added at the end then to create the steel. The remarkable thing about the Bessemer process is it typically would take 10, 20, maybe 30 minutes, usually 10, 20 minutes historically, to process about 5 tons of steel. while processes before this took over a day for the same amount of iron. This obviously exploded steel production's capabilities to unprecedented rates, accelerating industrialization way further than before. This all allowed for more cities to adopt technologies such as gas and water supplies and sewer systems, which increased population and an income growth at, again, a much faster rate than ever before. Perhaps the most important aspect, certainly we might think of it as the most important aspect today, is electricity. Michael Faraday, you may have heard the name Faraday, perhaps from a Faraday cage or something. He was a true genius, and his research developed the basis for the modern electromagnetic field theory. He also essentially invented the electric motor, which I believe is something most people don't think about as being absolutely integral to the movement of society. My guess on this would be because most cars run on internal combustion engines, and that's usually the extent of motors that most people interact with. Faraday began the electrical revolution, if you like, and soon power stations were being constructed. A power station is something we're all probably more familiar with, as we all have to pay the bill to keep the lights on, and we all know where the power for the lights comes from, I hope. It's power stations. Simply, it comes from power stations. Installations of these power stations in industrializing countries allowed for more advanced assembly lines and, of course, mass production increased as power no longer had to be generated on site from steam engines on site. Electricity could be transmitted through wires and then harnessed by factories from a power station relatively far away, and many factories and even more homes could do this all from one power station. Of course, power doesn't actually move through wires, and power is the incorrect term here, but this is a history episode, not a science one, so we'll ignore that for now. But think about I mentioned homes. So with the electrification process, you have the power generated off-site from factories, which of course has the ability to increase production, even on a minimal level, from removing the Watt steam engine and being able to place more machines or whatever, more people in its space, more workspace in the space it took up. But you also have homes getting electricity now as well. So homes can have lights, homes can have different forms of cooking food, which can cook food faster. This all increases productivity away from the factory, which can in turn increase productivity at the factory as well, if that makes sense. World War I can be seen as the end of the Second Industrial Revolution, and a third didn't really begin until after World War II in 1947, usually when it's demarcated. This is most commonly referred to as the Information Age. The key here is that societies shift from traditional manufacturing economies to information economies based in service. This is not to say each country or region around the world will all experience the first, and then the second, and then the third Industrial Revolution, as these are historical periods based around the experiences of industrializing Western Europe and the United States primarily. But it can be said, as I said near the beginning, most countries can be categorized in roughly 3 categories, which all roughly correspond to the activities and events found in each industrial revolution. We'll look at various countries after a little bit on the information age here. The real key with the information age is a shift from traditional manufacturing industries to, perhaps unsurprisingly, information technology and economies, as I said. Information technology, or just IT, as you've probably heard it called, is using computers and telecommunication systems to process information. Information economies are reliant on the transfer and sale of information as a commodity, rather than manufactured goods or raw materials. This, of course, is why we see the shift from secondary and primary sector activities to tertiary sector activities, which deal in the sale of information. That might seem a little weird to you, as I think commonly people will think of retail or restaurants or something as typical services. But if we think about it for a little bit, the reason your waiter or waitress at a restaurant has a job is because he or she is communicating information to you. He is selling his knowledge of the restaurant's menu and bar items to you to make money from you. You, the customer, still receive the food and drink, the physical thing, But the real sale came from the transfer of information, not of the food itself. The reason is because food is marked up at restaurants clearly. That's how restaurants make their money primarily. But the reason the food is able to be marked up is due to that sale of information. Because the food sale came from the farm, or more realistically, the food manufacturing facility that was in the primary or secondary sector. Since the restaurant is in the tertiary sector, the primary good transacted here is information. Same thing with retail. Let's take a look at a clothing store. The clerk is selling you the information of where the clothes you want are located, kind of a simple example, but this then becomes a part of the payment transaction for the actual goods. This is why the clothing can be marked up from what the store bought it for, is because there's an additional cost for providing the information about the good, and that's why they're able to mark it up, if that makes sense. But again, the sale of the actual goods, the clothing or whatever, was complete at the time of the print shop or the textile factories, the sale of the clothes to the clothing store. That was the sale of the actual goods. So the final sale of the clothes to you includes the physical clothing item, but also all of the costs of the information transfer that are attached to the cost of the clothing as well. This is what an information economy deals with, selling information as a primary commodity, even when you are still purchasing a physical good. If that it seems a little strange, send an email to the show and I'll try a different angle. So where does all of this information really come from? According to the United Nations Public Administration Network, or UNPAN, it all comes from computers. Yes, it was the server at the restaurant telling you the items on the menu, or the clerk telling you where the clothes were located in the store. That's a person-to-person transaction, right? Or interaction, I suppose. But the information was initially derived from computers. All of the menu items and all of the stock of the clothing store are kept in inventory in a computer. The menu was created in a computer, most likely. It's not a written menu. But even then, all of the inventory of all the food items that are kept in the restaurant are all kept in a computer. And the computer receives informational transactions from another computer to purchase all of those physical goods. This is how it works today. The information age is, and information economies are, reliant on computers. But then how did we end up here? I said the information age is demarcated to have started in 1947. The first actual computer we can sort of compare to modern computers, not really, but it's usually the one that most people will say is the first computer. It was built in 1945 and dedicated in 1946 to the US military, and it was called ENIAC. You may have heard of that before. That stands for Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator. It was about the size of a large room, and it weighed over 30 tons, so this is why I said it's maybe sort of not like computers today. You can look up more on that if you're interested. The first real personal computer was the Apple I in 1976, so about 30 years later. As computers became more and more advanced to what we use today, so did information systems and communications, especially since the advent of what we know as the Internet in 1989. I will certainly be doing episodes on computers and the Internet in the future. The real key timeline events that led to the expansion of the information age to be how it is experienced in the world today, well, mostly developed countries, but the key events are the invention of the transistor, which parenthetically I'm not going to explain here, the computers, and then making them smaller and smaller, and of course the Internet, or the World Wide Web. This is where we find much of the world today, either in a primary industrial revolution, or in an information age, or in between. So now let us take a walk through several countries and how they experienced or are still experiencing industrialization. We'll start with the United Kingdom, as I've already talked a bit about the country, and it was the first country in the world to industrialize. This was, of course, quite beneficial to the country, as it obtained the world's largest empire ever. It was the leading economic power for almost the entire 19th century. the first time that really ever happened. And the legacies felt today are as strong as ever, from language to music and literature to many more things most of us probably interact with every day. Leading up to industrialization for the first time was a range of influencing factors that developed the United Kingdom to heights not seen in most of the world. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Great Britain, as it's referred to, was already becoming a central world power, with the combining of England and Scotland, and the power of the Atlantic slave trade to the Caribbean, and the colonies in the current United States. This led to several preconditions for industrialization, including the agricultural revolution and stability and power in finance, government and control of resources, especially with respect to resources. It is noted in the literature that the abundance of coal and iron ore, which were located conveniently near rivers and established ports, made for the ability of creating and fueling industrial machinery more streamlined in a sense. In and around 1760, which I mentioned earlier, is demarcated as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The textile industry was the UK's foundation, with the inventions of the spinning jenny in 1764, sorry, not 1964, 1764, and the water frame in 1769, and then parenthetically the power loom later in 1785. As I described before, the Watt steam engine in 1769 provided reliable energy for mining, for machines, which led to factories and even transportation. Innovations in processing iron and steel made for easier production with higher quality products. Urbanization and population growth led to massive growth in urban centers and a number of factories, which resulted in wage labor and declining handcraft production. About a century later, in 1850, after the stagnation of the first Industrial Revolution, came the second, which saw massive expansion of railways, which led to stimulation of iron, steel, and coal production, and lowering transportation costs, which resulted in circular and cumulative growth. Expansion of chemical, electrical, and engineering industries created the moniker the workshop of the world for the UK. Liberalization of economic policy with things like free trade and patent law, created reinforcing institutions for investors and workers to benefit alike, though probably mostly investors benefiting financially. And after France was defeated in the early 19th century, the UK became the foremost naval and imperial power, creating the world's largest ever empire, which spanned over a quarter of the land on Earth. Speaking of empire, well, colonies specifically, the United States followed the United Kingdom's lead, but went rather nuclear in comparison. Not actual nuclear anything, it just expanded on industrialization even further. The United States was obviously a British colony until 1776, though the American Revolutionary War waged until 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Regardless of how Americans, especially today, might respond to this, the British influence ran heavy in the colonies. With the success of the first Industrial Revolution in the UK, even with the tensions between the British and the colonists, the first successful textile mill in the United States was established around 1790. The natural resources were perhaps even more abundant in the United States, with coal, iron, water, and especially timber nearly everywhere. At least where the colonies were, of course. The piece of machinery most Americans would be somewhat familiar with, I think, would be the cotton gin, created in 1793 by Eli Whitney, which, of course, made the separation of cotton fibers from their seeds easy and mechanized. Since even the 13 original British colonies were larger in landmass than the UK itself, and with the quick expansion of them further west, and south, I suppose, the transportation industry needed to grow quickly, very quickly. This led to inventions, expansions, and innovations which sprawled railways across the eastern United States, and other developments such as canals as well, with the particularly well-known one, the Erie Canal in 1825 in New York. That was from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. Leading up to the period of the Second Industrial Revolution, when the U.S. basically replaced the UK as the supreme world power in industry. And most everything else. The US transitioned from local markets to a national one as the country expanded further west. Urbanization, however, did not happen quite as quickly as in the UK, perhaps because of the larger landmass. Most Americans lived actually rurally until after the American Civil War in 1865. The Second Industrial Revolution, though, like I said, really accelerated the United States. If the foundations for inventions were in the UK, then the real innovators were in the US, though plenty of inventors were there too. Steel production took off with the Bessemer process, as I discussed earlier. That was, of course, created by Bessemer. I don't actually remember his first name. Electricity powering industries and homes exploded with Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. The automobile industry was effectively created by Henry Ford. The big tycoons created large enterprises like Andrew Carnegie with steel, John D. Rockefeller with oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt with railroads, J.P. Morgan with finance. They were all American. Through the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, America was the new workshop of the world, though no one referred to it as such as far as I know. The real key economic and institutional factors that led to all of this were the patent system, which of course encouraged innovation, enormous economic institutions and capital markets, primarily Wall Street, federal land grants supporting westward expansion, mass immigration from mostly Europe, which increased the labor force for factories and grew cities quicker than raw population growth, and that resulting in a large domestic market, which enabled economies of scale. Japan, however, is an interesting case because there was no British colonial influence, and Japan was almost entirely isolated and operated under feudalism really until 1868. The emperor at that time, Emperor Meiji, implemented two fundamental goals to industrialize and westernize, which led to the time period known as the Meiji Restoration. These are known as Fukoku Kyohei, which translates to rich country, strong army, and Shokusan Kogyo, which translates to encourage industry. The reforms which were brought about due to these goals included abolishing the feudal domains and practices and creating a centralized government, and a land tax reform due to this. The national education system was established as well, since the cultivation of human capital was recognized as key to industrialization and modernization. Also, because of Fukoku Kyohei, a strong military was created, and with the modernization tactics of the West, it was very strong. And of course, massive infrastructure projects started, like railways and ports and a telecommunications network. So fairly standard stuff as far as industrialization went, but the major difference here from the US and the UK is that all of these projects were state-led by the Meiji central government instead of by entrepreneurs and inventors. Textiles were first, mostly silk and cotton, and heavy industry followed with a focus on iron and steel, especially shipbuilding and machinery as well. World War I also helped Japan with exported products because Western countries were preoccupied and needed more materials for the war. Leading up to World War II, Japan was one of the most industrialized countries in the world, and throughout the war remained so. Post-World War II, the economy was devastated, and Japan was occupied by Allied forces, but today Japan is highly developed, fully industrialized, and one of the richest countries in the world. China, whose history with Japan is quite bloody, yet didn't really industrialize until after World War II. There was a first attempt at industrialization in the late 19th century and before World War I, but ultimately it did not pan out as planned. The goal in this early stage was to adopt Western technology while keeping the Confucian values in government. There was some significant amount of industrialization, actually, mainly with the textile and shipbuilding industries, again with the textile industry, as well as some military strengthening. Modern school systems were also established, although, again, the extent of the success of this was quite limited. The main prohibiting factor was very rudimentary and limited implementation of telegraph and railway networks. There was just no communication and connection between growing city centers. This, of course, limited supply lines as well drastically, and it really didn't allow China to industrialize. The cultural and governmental values of China, especially on the traditional conservative side, were fighting industrialization along the way, making it all the more difficult to do so. Some small parts were fairly industrialized, like the Jiangnan Arsenal and the Fuzhou shipyard, but it was uneven, and most of the country remained rural and traditional. There was some privatization and other things that slowly moved industrialization along until 1949, but it wasn't until the People's Republic of China, that was established under Mao Zedong in 1949, that industrialization really occurred. Mirrored here with the experience of Japan, industrialization was state-led, as was almost everything in Mao's China. And there were three main periods here that Chinese society moved through, and the progress of industrialization in the country follows. The first 5-year plan occurred from 1953 to 1957 and saw massive urban industrial expansion. With the help of the Soviets, over 150 massive industrial projects were started, like large-scale coal power plants and steel mills, shipyards, things like that. The Great Leap Forward, which you may have heard of before, occurred subsequently from 1958 to 1961. The main goal here was to overtake Western countries by industrializing the still heavy rural parts of China, making for more and more people and land incorporated into the industrial machine. This failed, though, because of the reason why most people have probably heard of the Great Leap Forward as a historic period. This rural expansion did not work due to inefficiencies in production, and economic collapse and famine, killing tens of millions, followed. Then came the Central Planning Recovery period from 1962 to 1976. A centrally planned economy is another form of how an economy functions in a country, with the other common form today being a free market economy. I would have explained this in detail in a previous episode. This recovery from economic collapse is demarcated to have ended in 1976 when Mao Zedong passed away, and from there onwards into the 1990s, China saw their industrial revolution finally take place on the foundation built from inefficient means in the previous decades. Deng Xiaoping became the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China until 1989, and under him the agricultural industry spread out to cover more land to feed more people. There was also a focus on light manufacturing, textiles, electronics, that kind of thing. China also moved from a centrally planned economy to a what they called a socialist market economy, which I haven't explained before. It really only exists in China, and it's different from a free market economy because the state owns the land and operates the enterprises and facilities. Through this rapid expansion of industry and population growth, China became the world's predominant manufacturing country in the 2010s, and is definitely still today. India is different yet again, and today is still not considered a fully industrialized country. The basis of Indian industrialization came from the colonial period of almost 200 years. Before this, there were proto-industrial handcraft industries, especially with textiles. During the colonial period, Britain favored importing manufactured goods from Britain and exporting raw materials from India, which sort of halted the industrial progress. In the mid-19th century, some industrialization projects were developed, with some telegraph and railway lines being built, and textile, iron, and steel industries were sort of established. Post-colonialism, India adopted a centrally planned economy inspired by the Soviet Union, and multiple 5-year plans were created starting in 1951. This led to the development of a rather strong industrial base, but protectionism ran high with tariff laws, and regulation kept the country with uneven and inefficient industrial practices. In 1991, India was faced with some rather severe financial difficulties, mostly with balance of payments and debts probably from the attempt to industrialize India without much trade or foreign intervention. The prime minister at the time introduced multiple reforms that really started industrialization and fitting India into the global market. The license Raj refers to the system of strict regulation that kept India dependent on itself, with limited trade and high tariffs. I don't actually know what Raj stands for, but this was subsequently scrapped in the administration of 1991. This led to liberalization of trade with low tariffs and foreign investment. Much of the state-controlled enterprise was sold off and restructured, which led to privatization of industry. While there was expansion of hard manufacturing with automobiles, steel, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals, India's path to industrialization was really led by service rather than manufacturing, which makes it sort of a unique case. This may sound strange, but many industrializing countries today sort of skip many of the stages that the world's first industrializing countries and their economies went through. It is probably commonly known that India is a leader in information technology services, and it is rather true there are a lot of call centers in the country from multinational corporations. And the reason this happens is because industrializing countries and countries that haven't quite industrialized yet, they sort of need to fill in gaps in the world economy that need to be filled in, if that makes sense. And so getting to even less developed countries now, let's start with Cambodia. Much unlike the rest of these countries, Cambodia didn't even begin any form of real industrialization until the 1990s. The efforts have been foreign-led instead of state-led. Also, even today, there isn't much higher-level manufacturing, such as with electronics, and the country's industry focuses quite heavily on clothing, garments, and footwear. Cambodia found independence from the French in 1953 and remained mostly agrarian afterward. There were some early industrialization and modernization efforts moving into the 60s, but essentially all of it was erased with the introduction of the Khmer Rouge. If you are unaware, the Khmer Rouge was the Communist Party that ruled Cambodia from 1975 to 1979 under Pol Pot. The practices of this regime not only devastated any industrial progress, but set the country further back than before, which then took time to recover from. By the time the Khmer Rouge was overthrown in 1979, the economy had completely collapsed. There were some Vietnamese-influenced attempts at socialist reconstruction in the following decade, but it wasn't really until the Paris Peace Accords in 1991 that the country could finally see some progress. In the past few decades, as I said, Cambodia relies heavily on foreign investment to attempt to grow their industrial base, and I think something like 70, maybe even 80% of the country's exports are garments, clothing, footwear, and the like. Finally, moving away from Asia, though, let's talk about Nigeria for our last country. As with other colonized countries, industry and infrastructure was primarily developed by the mother country in the interest of raw resource extraction. So as with Cambodia, although with the British, not with the French, when Nigeria came to independence in 1960, there existed pretty much no industrial base. Unlike many Eastern Asian countries that turned to communism, Nigeria adopted a policy known as Import Substitution Industrialization, ISI. This actually advocates using domestic production to replace foreign imports. The problem is Nigeria, again, has really no industrial base at this time. So the country used tariffs and state-owned enterprises while encouraging foreign companies to produce in Nigeria. This helped to transform Nigeria's economy somewhat, but it wasn't really until the 1970s when the oil reserves that the country were discovered that the economy was really transformed. The main problem here is that now Nigeria is almost entirely dependent on oil exports, which is a raw resource, much like the current Cambodia with garment exports, although garments are not a raw resource, they're a manufactured commodity. Garments also don't really shift in price, but oil certainly does. And in the 1980s, Nigeria faced debt and other economic crises due to falling oil prices. This caused local industry to be outcompeted with cheaper foreign business, and Nigeria became more deindustrialized rather than continuing to industrialize. Past the 2000s, Nigeria has begun to reform economic policy, but continues to face uneven distribution of industrialization. The country today is still not considered to be industrialized, just like Cambodia and India before, as less than 10% of Nigeria's GDP is derived from manufacturing. However, a benefit of increasing globalization is that many countries are still able to afford a higher quality of living without needing to be fully industrialized, which was not the case during the first and second industrial revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, to cap off this episode, I'll ask the question, are we heading into a fourth industrial revolution, or are we perhaps already in one? Well, in 2016, the chairman of the World Economic Forum, the WEF, which parenthetically we shall discuss soon, Klaus Schwab, the chairman, used the term Fourth Industrial Revolution in a book, if I remember correctly. I don't remember the name of the book. You could probably think about this as the AI revolution too, or something along those lines. You could probably think about, driverless cars, robots in warehouses, smart glasses that tell you information about what you're looking at, other smart devices. These are just examples, but think of the fourth industrial revolution as technology replacing humans. That sounds rather morbid. And perhaps for a lot of people it is, but the idea of it is replacing things that don't necessarily need to be done by humans, that technology we have invented can do instead. This frees up human time, energy, and capital to work on other things to improve standards of living. The first industrial revolution was the beginning of mechanization of basic industries in Britain, and later in Western Europe and the United States, I believe also Canada, perhaps some other countries. Australia, maybe. I don't actually know when Australia was colonized. The second industrial revolution could be seen as technological advancement towards mass production. The third could be seen as the information age, where information services replaced traditional industries as the primary driver of economies. And the fourth now could be seen as, I said, the AI revolution, the artificial intelligence revolution, where rapid technological advancement bolsters the human ability to continue moving forward. That's all I have to discuss for today, I think, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode, as the next episode will probably be one of a lot of facts and information, so it'll be an interesting task for me to try and make it interesting and not too much of an overload. But I'll do my best, as I think the information is interesting and important. If you'd like to send me an email, you can do so at fabricofindustry@gmail.com. That's the show's email. I'd love a positive review posted on the podcast aggregator of your choice as well. Spotify and Apple, mostly Spotify, seem to be the dominant forces there still. You can also visit our Facebook page and give us a like, and join our Discord from there as well. That helps spread the podcast around so more listeners can receive this information. And with that, I'll talk to you next time.